Have you ever had the feeling that something or someone is watching you? That no matter where you go, no matter how fast you run, a pair of unseen eyes are locked onto you? What if I told you that in the quiet town of St. Albans, there is something or someone who never stops watching, and once you see her, she never lets you go? You ever hear about something so terrifying, so disturbing, that it sticks in your mind like a dark shadow, refusing to fade? This is one of those stories. A story that isn't just whispered around campfires, but has left real people shaken to their core. They call it the Lady in the Van. It all started in the quiet town of St. Albans, a place where history breathes through old buildings and narrow streets. But hidden beneath its charm is something sinister, something no one likes to talk about. Because once you hear about her, she never really leaves you alone. It was a cold autumn evening when Alan drove home after work. He was tired, his mind wandering as he passed the same streets he'd driven down 1,000 times. But that night, something was different. His headlights flickered for a brief second, and there, parked under an old street lamp, was a van he'd never seen before. It looked ancient, rusted, and covered in dirt, like it had been abandoned for years. Yet, through the foggy glass, he could see a shadowy figure sitting in the driver's seat. A woman, her head tilted slightly, and though her features were obscured, he felt her watching him. His hands tightened on the wheel as a chill ran down his spine. He told himself it was nothing, just some old van left to rot. But as he drove past, the van's headlights flickered, like they were blinking at him. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the van, the woman, the silent gaze. By morning, he convinced himself it was all in his head. But as he drove to work, his heart nearly stopped. The van was there again, parked in a different spot. This time, there was no mistaking it. She was looking directly at him. Days passed, and the van appeared everywhere. Outside his office, near his home, even parked at the grocery store. The same rusted exterior, the same foggy windows, and the woman inside. Never moving, never blinking, just watching. Alan became obsessed. He asked around, but no one seemed to know where the van had come from. Neighbors shrugged it off. Co-workers laughed. But then he met an old man at a diner, a man whose face turned pale at the mention of the van. "You've seen her?" the man whispered. Alan nodded, and the old man leaned in, his voice barely above a breath. "They say she's been here for decades, always watching, always waiting. She was a widow back in the 60s, lost her husband in a tragic accident. Drove around looking for him, convinced he wasn't dead. She wouldn't accept it. People saw her, driving aimlessly, stopping random strangers, asking if they'd seen her husband. She started losing her mind. Then, one day, she vanished. Just disappeared. Some say she drove herself into the river. Others say she just faded away, her grief consuming her completely." Alan's stomach twisted. "But the van," the old man sighed. "Every few years, someone new sees it. A rusted old van, a woman inside. She doesn't speak, just watches. If you see her too many times..." He hesitated. Bad things happen. Alan tried to shake it off, but the fear had settled deep inside him. That night, he was afraid to look out his window, afraid of what he might see. But curiosity won. He peeked outside, and his blood turned to ice. The van was parked right outside his house. This time, the door was slightly open. The woman wasn't inside. She was standing in his yard. His breath caught in his throat. Her head tilted, just like before, her hollow eyes locked onto his. Alan stumbled back, grabbing his phone. But his hands were shaking too much to dial. A sound echoed in the room, not from outside, from inside. A creaking noise, slow and deliberate. He turned. The woman stood in his hallway. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a deep, guttural sound that made his ears ring. He backed away, but she took a step forward, her skeletal fingers twitching. The lights flickered. Shadows twisted in unnatural ways. Then, darkness. The next morning, Alan's house was empty. His door left ajar, his car still in the driveway. No one saw him leave. No one saw him at all. Just his house, silent and still. But the van was gone.